Chapter 4. Sano rode his horse out the northern portal of Edo Castle towards the temple where his cousin Chiyo had last been seen. Although peace had blessed the capital for more than a year, troops still stood sentry outside the massive iron-banded gate and occupied the guardhouse above. More troops manned the watchtowers. Political or civil unrest could start up again any day. A squadron from his personal army accompanied Sano. He wouldn't put it past Yanagisawa to attack him after lulling him into compliance. His chief bodyguards, Detective Marume and Fukita, trotted in their mounts beside him along the road that sloped down from the castle. Below them spread the grey tile rooftops of the vast city, whose far reaches disappeared into the mist and rain that cloaked the hills. The brawny, cheerful Marume drew a deep breath of the humid air and said, "It feels good to be out and about again. We've been cooped up inside the castle forever." "I'm sorry your cousin is missing, Sano-san, but I'm glad to have a new investigation," said Fukita, the serious half of the pair. Sano shared his men's renewed sense of energy and excitement. The thrill of the chase was a relief after sitting at a desk shuffling papers, conducting meetings, and diffusing crises in the government. There was one reason he'd decided to lead the search himself, even though he had to put off other important business. "And guess what?" Marume said. "This is the first time we're not working for the Shogun." "For once he won't be holding the threat of death over our heads," Fukita said. "Thank the gods for small favors," Sano said. He and his men laughed, enjoying their unusual freedom, but dark currents of emotion ran beneath Sano's high spirits. He had a blood connection to the missing woman, even though he'd never met Chiyo. He couldn't leave her fate to someone else, not even his most trusted subordinates. And what if he didn't find her? What if she was dead when he did? Not only would a father lose his favorite daughter, a husband his wife, and 2 children their mother, but Sano would lose an opportunity to know the member of his new family. "My gut tells me that we'll find your cousin," Marume said. "Your gut has gotten fat from sitting around and eating too much," Fukita teased with a straight face. Marume reached behind Sano, swatted at Fukita and said, "No, I'm telling you, this is our lucky day. But even if we don't find her, at least Major Kumasawa can kill us." Nevertheless, Sano feared disappointing Major Kumasawa. He shouldn't care what his relative who had ostracized him from the clan thought of him, but he did. Meeting his uncle had reawakened feelings of inferiority that he'd believed he'd shed years ago. A short time with Major Kumasawa had reverted him to the mere son of a ronin he'd once been. If he didn't find Chiyo, his uncle's low opinion of him would be justified. And even though the strong, independent part of Sano said, "To hell with Major Kumasawa," that would hurt. "It must be strange to meet relatives that you spent most of your life never knowing you had," Fukita said. "You can't imagine," Sano said. Asakusa Kannon Temple, dedicated to Kannon, the Buddhist deity of mercy and salvation, was Edo's most popular temple. The route to Asakusa district lay along the Ushukaido, the northern highway. Beyond the edge of town, the highway was built up on a wide earthen embankment above rice paddies. A few peasants' water buffaloes and tiny huts dotted the lush green paddies. The air stank of the night soil used for fertilizer. Even on this wet afternoon in the rainy season, Sano and his entourage found the highway crowded with traffic. Bands of religious pilgrims, carrying staffs and chanting prayers, marched in step. Itinerant priests trudged, laden with heavy packs. Families traveled to Asakusa for blessings. Samurai rode in the privilege of their class, commoners walked. But not all the traffic was connected with religion. Once Sano and his party had to steer their horses to the edge of the highway to make way for a cart drawn by oxen and heaped with roof tiles. Carts like this, owned by the government, were the only wheeled vehicles permitted by Tokugawa law. This restricted the movement of war supplies and prevented insurrections, at least in theory. Many of the other travelers weren't going to Asakusa at all. Beyond the temple lay the Yoshiwara licensed pleasure quarter, the only place in Edo where prostitution was legal. Merchants riding in palanquins, gangs of townsmen on foot, and samurai on horseback streamed towards Yoshiwada's brothels. The law banned samurai from the pleasure quarter, but they went in droves anyways. Yoshiwada was good business in Temple District. Men traveling to Yoshiwada often stopped at the temple for rest, refreshments, and prayers, combining the profane with the sacred. What was your cousin doing as Asakusa if she wanted to go to a shrine? Why not one in town? Marume asked. The Kumasawa family estate is out here, Sano said. His uncle was in charge of guarding the Shogun's rice depot, located on the rivers of east of Asakusa. He also commanded the troops that patrolled the district. The Kumasawa house was the only one in which Sano's mother had grown up, but Sano had yet to lay his eyes on it. Perhaps he soon would. Within an hour, Asakusa appeared on the misty horizon. Originally a small outpost of the city, the site of the temple since ancient times, it had grown into a large, flourishing suburb. Other temples clustered around Asakusa Cannon like chicks around a hen. Above the rooftops rose the graceful silhouettes of pagodas. The rice field gave way to houses on streets that branched off the highway. The neighborhood soon grew as dense as any in town. Hawkers wooed customers into shops that sold Buddhist rosaries, incense, shoes, fans, umbrellas, and other merchandise. A bargain price sampling of the goods sold at the big market inside the temple precinct. Balconies adorned with potted plants sheltered the crowds from the drizzle that began to fall. The streets narrowed. Sano and his men rode in single file. Marume led, scouting a safe passage. Have you any ideas about what happened to your cousin? Fukita said, trailing behind Sano with the other guards. The only thing I know for sure is that Chio is either gone from the district or still inside it, Sano said. We'll try to determine which is the case. He dismounted at the gate that divided one block from the next. These gates were features common to all cities. At night, they were closed to keep residents confined and prevent trouble. By day, they served as security checkpoints. This is as good a place as any. Maroon backtracked to join Sano and the other men. Isn't this territory that your uncle has already covered? He might have overlooked something, Sano said, then addressed the watchman at the gate. I'm looking for a missing woman, he began. The watchman was a young peasant. He'd been chatting with the tea seller who'd put down his bucket and cups and stopped to rest. His round face blanched with fright. I haven't seen her! I swear! He fell to his knees, bowed and cringed almost in tears. I haven't done anything wrong! If you haven't done anything wrong, then why are you so afraid? Sano asked. The tea seller, an older man with the bluff, confident air of a street merchant, said, because of that older samurai who came by yesterday, asking about a missing woman. He and his soldiers roughed up anyone they thought were hiding something, or who didn't answer fast enough. Dismay spread through Sano. Who was he? I don't know, he didn't bother to introduce himself. He had deep wrinkles here and here. The tea seller drew his fingers across his forehead and down his cheeks. Major Kuwasawa, Sano said grimly. The tea seller gestured at the watchman. He gave my poor friend here quite a beating. Sounds like your uncle hasn't exactly smoothed the way for us, Marume said. I understand how desperate he must be to find his daughter, Fukita said, but beating up witnesses won't help. Sano had thought this would be one investigation he could conduct without interference. My apologies for what happened to you, he said to the watchman. Now tell me if you've seen a strange woman wandering by herself or being forced to go with someone, or looking as if she were in trouble. The watchman swore that he hadn't, so did the tea seller. She's 33 years old, and she was wearing a lavender kimono with small white flowers on it, Sano said. He asked his uncle what clothes Chio had been wearing. Think hard. Are you sure you haven't seen a woman who matched the description? Both men said they were. Sano believed them. He and his comrades moved on a long street of food stalls. Vendors grilled eels, prawns, and squid on skewers over open hearths, boiled pots of rice, noodles, and soup. Fragrant steam and smoke billowed into the drizzle. I'm hungry, Marume said. You always are, Fukita said. Sano hadn't eaten since morning, before the tournament. He and his men bought food. After they ate, they questioned more people. They soon learned that Major Kumasawa and his troop had already passed through this whole area that surrounded the temple, intimidating, torturing, and offending everywhere, and Sano's attempt to trade Chio proved as fertile as his uncle's. "No, I haven't seen her," said one vendor, shopkeeper, and peddler after another. "Nobody's hiding any woman on my block," said the headman of every street. "Major Kumasawa threatened to have my head cut off if I didn't help him fight his daughter. So I've been looking for her on my rounds," said a Doshin, police patrol officer. "I've questioned everyone I've met, no luck." "It's looking as if she left the district," Sano said, as he and his men led their horses through an alley, whether on her own or against her will. They turned down a road that bordered a canal under the construction. Laborers armed with shovels and picks were digging a wide, deep trench. Peasants hauled up dirt and loaded it onto ox carts. Sano, Marume, and Fukita gazed into the trench, at the lumpy, freshly exposed earth on the bottom. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" Marume asked. Sano refused to consider the possibility that his cousin had been killed and buried here or someplace else. "We'll keep looking. Let's go to the shrine." As they headed further into Asakusa district, the drizzle turned into sprinkles, then a fierce downpour. Rain boiled up from tile roofs, cascaded off eaves and puddled the streets. The air dissolved in mist. Sano, the detective, and his other men took cover on the balcony, while their horses stoically endured the deluge, and people ran for shelter. "There go our witnesses," Fukita said glumly. Lightning flashed. The dark sky blazed bright white for an instant. Thunder cracked. The world outside the small dry space where Sano and his men stood were a streaming grey blur. Down the vacant street, a lone human figure emerged from the storm and stumbled in their direction. "Somebody doesn't know enough to get out of the rain," Marume said. The figure drew near, limping and crouching. Sano saw that it was a woman. Her black hair hung in long, dripping tangles. Torn and drenched, her dark red and pale lavender kimono was plastered against her slim body. With one hand, she held the garment closed over her bosom. With the other, she groped as if she were blind. "What on earth?" Fukita began. Now Sano saw that the red streaks on her kimono weren't dyed into the fabric. The rain washed them down her skirts into the puddles through which she limped barefoot. She was bleeding. Sano ran towards the woman. The storm battered him. He was instantly soaked to the skin. She faltered, her eyes wide and blank with terror. Rain trickled into her open, gasping mouth. She wasn't young or old. She could be in her 30s. Her features were startlingly familiar to Sano. She recoiled from him, lost her balance. He caught her, and she screamed and flailed. Don't be afraid," Sano shouted over a crash of thunder. "I won't hurt you." As she fought him, the detective hurried to Sano's aid. The woman began to weep, crying, "No, no, leave me alone, please!" "Stand back," Sano ordered his men. They obeyed. "Who are you?" he urgently asked the woman. Her gaze met his. The blankness in her eyes cleared. She stopped fighting Sano. Her expression showed puzzlement, wonder, and hope. Sano was astounded by recognition. As the rain swept them, he flashed back to a memory from his early childhood. In those days, his mother had often taken him into the public bathhouse because they didn't have room for a tub in their small, humble home. He remembered how she dunked under the hot water and come up with her hair and face streaming wet. His mind superimposed this picture of his mother upon the woman in her arms. The woman was his mother's younger image. "Is your name Chio?" Sano asked. Yes, his cousin whispered, her voice drowned by the storm. Her eyes closed, and she went limp in Sano's grasp as she fainted. Chapter 5. Light from a round white lantern cast a lunar glow in the room where Yanikisawa and his son Yoritomo lay side by side, face down on low wooden tables. Their long naked bodies were identically proportioned. Yanikisawa's almost as slender, strong and perfect as 23-year-old Yoritomo's. Their faces turned toward each other, at the same dark beauty. The skin glistened with oil as two masseurs kneaded their backs, working out the aches from the morning's tournament. Intense smoke rose from a brass burner, sweet and pungent, masking the odors of dampness and decay. Outside rain poured down, thunder rumbled. "Father, may I ask you a question?" Yoritomo said, respectful and deferential as always. "Of course," Yanagisawa said. He didn't hesitate to talk in front of the masseurs. Other people had blind masseurs, an ancient tradition. Yanagisawa's were deaf and dumb. They wouldn't hear or spread tales, and although he usually hated being interrogated, he made an exception for Yoritomo. He distrusted and disliked most people, with good reason. He'd been stabbed in the back so many times that it was a wonder he hadn't bled to death. But his son was his love, the only person to whom he felt a connection, his blood. He had 4 other children, but Yoritomo was the only one that mattered. He would gladly tell Yoritomo all his secret, or almost all. "Are things really settled between you and Sano?" Yoritomo asked. "For the moment," Yanagisawa said, "but some scores could never be settled." "I don't understand how you can be friends with him," Yoritomo said. He and Sano had once been close friends, Yanagisawa knew. During the 3 years that Yanagisawa had been in exile, Sano had taken the opportunity to cultivate Yoritomo, who was the shogun's favorite lover and companion. Yoritomo had grown attached to Sano and bravely defended him against his enemies. But no more. Not after what he did to us. Yoritomo spoke with the indignation of trust and affected betrayed. Last year Sano had accused Yoritomo of treason and had staged a trial and fake execution in order to force Yanagisawa into the open. "I've never been so terrified in my life." Neither had Yanagisawa when he'd heard that his son was to be put to death. "Even though Sano apologized, I'll never forgive him," Yoritomo said, his voice hard, his sweet gentle nature turned hateful by Sano's trick. "How can you?" Yanagisawa couldn't. Whenever he thought of that day, he shook with fury, but he controlled his emotions, lest they goad him into a rash action, and he had to convince Yoritomo to follow his example. "One can do whatever one must. Don't dwell on what Sano did to you, it'll only make you feel worse." Yoritomo stared in amazement. "Can you honestly say that you don't hate Sano as much as I do? After all, it's not just me that Sano has humiliated." Yoritomo was so upset that he forgot his polite manners. "Look at yourself, father. Once you were the only chamberlain, the shogun's only second in command. Now you have to share the honors with Sano, and he's not only stolen half your position, he has your house." The shogun had given the chamberlain's compound to Sano when Yanagisawa had been exiled. The very idea of Sano in his home rang terribly with Yanagisawa, who now lived here, in a smaller estate in the castle's official quarter. Among his subordinates, his new mansion was too close to the street. He could hear voices and hoofbeats outside. He felt crowded by his servants and troops. How he missed the space and privacy he'd once enjoyed. It was too bad that the traps he'd installed in his old home hadn't killed Sano. "Why don't you punish him?" Yoritomo said, hungry for revenge. "Why do we have to act as if everything is alright? Why can't we fight back?" "Because we would lose," Yanagisawa said bluntly. "No, we wouldn't," Yoritomo protested. "You have lots of allies, lots of troops." "So does Sano." "Your position is stronger than his." "That's what I thought when I went up against Lord Matsudaya. I was wrong. His troops slaughtered mine on the battlefield." Yanagisawa's thought darkened with the memory. "My allies defected to him like rats fleeing a sinking ship." "No," he declared. "I won't risk another war. But nothing," Yanagisawa said, harsh in his determination to convince his son. "We were let off easy last time. You were allowed to stay in Edo." The shogun had insisted on keeping Yoritomo with him, even though Lord Matsudaya had wanted to exile Yanagisawa's whole family. "I was banished instead of killed. Next time we won't be so fortunate." Yoritomo beheld Yanagisawa with a mixture of resignation and disappointment. "You're saying you've given up? Because you're afraid of losing? Afraid of dying?" The masseur pressed his fingers deep into Yanagisawa's shoulder, touching tender spots. Yanagisawa winced. His son had always idolized him, but now Yoritomo had accused him of being a coward. The accusation was unjust. "Sometimes fear is better to guide than courage is, he said. Courage had led many a man to do the wrong things, with disastrous results. I learned that lesson when I took on Lord Matsudaya. We can't seize power by force. You should have learned it too, when you were young. He watched Yoritomo blush, shamed by the implied accusation of stupidity. You don't understand that when a strategy fails, you shouldn't rush out and do the same thing again. If you want different results, you have to try a new strategy. Hope brightened in Yoritomo's gaze. Do you mean you have a new plan for defeating Sano and put us on top of the regime? Oh yes, Yanagisawa smiled with pleasure as his masseur worked the stiffness out of his back muscles. Never let it be said that I don't have a plan. But how can you win without going to war? The time for war was over more than a century ago, when the Tokugawa clan and its allies conquered their rivals and unified Japan, Yanagisawa said, wise in hindsight. This dictatorship won't be won by military maneuvers. I see now. Today's political climate calls for more subtle tactics. What are they? What are you going to do? Apprehension shadowed Yoritomo's beautiful face. Is there a part in your plan for me? Yanagisawa was touched by his son's wish to be included in whatever he did, no matter the dangers. Yoritomo was so good, so loyal. Never fear, Yanagisawa said. You're key to my whole scheme. Yoritomo was Yanagisawa's best hope of one day ruling Japan. Yanagisawa had big plans for him. Now listen. Chapter 6. Sano and his retinue escorted his cousin Chiyo home. She rode semi-conscious in the palanquin carried by bears that Sano had hired. The storm decreased to a light rain, and the afternoon faded into dusk as he and his men accompanied the palanquin through the samurai enclave near the shogun's rice warehouses along the river. The rice was used to pay the Tokugawa retainers their stipends. Heavily guarded by Major Kumasawa's troops, it was sold to rice brokers and converted into cash by a bevy of officials. Lanterns flickered outside the walled estate where Major Kumasawa and the officials lived. Sentries and guardhouses looked up to watch Sano's procession pass. This part of town was older than the rest of Edo. The white plaster on the walls were patched, the roof tiles weathered, roads narrow and serpentine. Sano didn't think he'd been here before. The double-roofed gate that displayed a banner emblazoned with the Kumasawa family crest, a stylized bear, head in a circle, struck him an eerie chord of recognition. He and his men dismounted, and Sano ordered the sentries, "Tell Major Kumasawa I've brought his daughter home." The sentries rushed to open the gate. Sano found himself in the courtyard lit by fires and stone lanterns outside the mansion. A low half-timbered building raised on a stone foundation. Rain trickled off the overhanging eaves. Major Kumasawa rushed out the door, trailed by a grey-haired woman. They halted on the veranda. Deja vu assailed Sano. Images surfaced from the depths of his mind. He had a vision of the same courtyard, of Major Kumasawa and this woman, who must be his wife. But they were younger, their hair black, their faces unlined. Sano heard a woman pleading and weeping, somewhere out of sight. Dizziness and chills rushed through him. For a moment he couldn't breathe. His vision was a memory. He had come here before. But when? And why? The images, sounds, and sensations vanished as Major Kumasawa and his wife hurried to the palanquin. Major Kumasawa opened the door inside. Chiyo lay motionless, covered by a kilt that Sano had bought in the shop. Her eyes were closed, her head wrapped in a white cotton cloth stained with blood. Major Kumasawa's wife cried out in dismay. The major demanded, "What happened to her?" He didn't thank Sano for bringing Chiyo home. Detective Marume and Fukita frowned at this affront to their master. But Sano recalled how he'd felt when reunited with his own kidnapped child. Courtesy had been the last thing on his mind. "There's a cut on her head," Sano said. That, as he discovered, was the source of the blood on her clothes. "She hasn't any other injuries as far as I could see, but you should send for a doctor." Major Kumasawa barked orders to the servant who appeared on the veranda, then asked Sano, "Where did you find her?" "On a street in Asakusa district," Sano said. "I'll bring her in the house." As Major Kumasawa lifted his daughter, she awakened. She began to struggle. "No!" she cried. "Don't touch me! Get away!" It's all right, little one," Major Kumasawa said. It was as gentle as if you were talking to a child. "It's Papa. You're home safe now." The struggle ceased. She quieted. "Papa," she whispered. As he carried her towards the house, his wife bustled along with them, stroking Chio's pale, muddy cheek, murmuring endearments. Major Kumasawa looked over her shoulder at Sano. "I'm in debt to you," he said gruffly. "If you and your men would like to come in, please do." "Right this way, Honorable Chamberlain," said a servant. Sano could tell that his uncle didn't want him here, but he was curious to see the house. Perhaps it would trigger more memories. Furthermore, Sano had a stubborn streak. "Come on," he told his detectives, and followed the servant inside the mansion. They left their shoes and swords in the entryway. They were led down a corridor with polished cedar floors, past rooms concealed behind ladders and paper partitions. They arrived in a reception room with a dais backed by a landscape mirror and an alcove that held a vase of chrysanthemums. The house seemed familiar to Sano, but only because it had the same architecture and decor as other samurai homes, including his own. His own was much bigger than this, but he looked at his uncle's home through the eyes of a child he'd once been. His family had lived in a tiny house behind the martial arts school that his father had operated. Compared to that, Major Kumasawa's estate was a palace. Sano thought of how his mother must have felt, banished to what had surely seemed like a squalor to her. He recalled the days when food had been scarce, winters when their house had been freezing because they couldn't afford enough coal. He knew his mother had suffered more than he had. Major Kumasawa must have known about her poverty. He could have helped, but he hadn't. Sano thought of the memory he had experienced outside. He tried to dredge it up into the light where he could examine it, but it slipped away, elusive as a ghost. After a long interval, Major Kumasawa entered the room. She was being cared for by her mother and her maids. He gestured to Sano and the detective and said, "Please sit." Sano knelt in the position of honor by the alcove. The detectives near him. Major Kumasawa seated himself on the dais. He didn't offer refreshments, not that Sano would have accepted. Major Kumasawa was clearly ill at ease. He didn't like entertaining a stranger who was his bloodkin and an outcast. Sano himself didn't exactly feel at home. "I looked all over Asakura district and didn't find Chio," Major Kumasawa said. "How did you find her?" "Spotted her wandering in the rainstorm," Sano said. "What a stroke of good luck." Then Major Kumasawa seemed to realize how ungraceful he sounded. "But you brought my daughter back to me." I apologized for my bad manners. For once, he seemed honestly contrite about how he'd behaved towards Sano. "1,000 thanks." Sano bowed, accepting the thanks and the apology. He began to realize that Major Kumasawa's treatment of him wasn't entirely personal. Old samurai often became curmudgeons. If that was true of his uncle, Sano could live with it. "How did Chio get there?" Major Kumasawa asked. "It would seem that someone kidnapped her, then dumped her in the street," Sano said. "Who?" Major Kumasawa clenched his fist. His expression tightened with anger. "Your guess is as good as mine," Sano said. "While I was tending to your daughter, I sent my men to look around the area. It was deserted because of the rain. They didn't see anyone." Major Kumasawa brooded darkly. 2 days ago she was gone. Where was she? What happened to her during all that time?" The sound of a sob interrupted the conversation. Sano, the detective, and Major Kumasawa looked up and saw Chio's mother standing in the doorway. Tears streaked her contorted face. Major Kumasawa rose and went to her. She whispered in his ear, then fled. He returned to his guest, clearly shaken. My daughter," he began, then swallowed and drew a deep breath. "When my wife undressed and bathed Chio, she saw injuries and blood," he finished in a low, broken voice. My daughter has been violated." Her torn clothes had suggested the possibility of rape to Sano, but he was dismayed to have his suspicions confirmed. Major Kumasawa sank to his knees, stricken with horror and anguish. Rape was a terrible thing to happen to a woman, perhaps worse than death. Rape contaminated her body and spirit, destroyed her chastity and her honor. Sano and the detective bowed their heads in sympathy. Indignation transformed Major Kumasawa's face into a hideous mask so flushed with red that Sano thought the man would burst a vein. "This thing that has been done to my daughter is a disgrace! But it's not against the law!" Tokugawa law didn't recognize rape as a crime. Men could take their sexual satisfaction where they chose against a woman's will and not be punished. But Chio's case was different. "Your daughter was the victim of kidnapping," Sano said, "and she was injured. The violation constitutes an assault. Kidnapping and assault are both illegal. The law won't let whoever hurt Chio get away with it." This rapist had earned a stay in prison and tortured by the jailers. He could also be sentenced to live as an outcast for a term set by the magistrate, and since he'd chosen a victim with political connections, he might even get death penalty. Major Kumasawa grimaced. "Tell that to the police. They wouldn't even do anything to find Chio. They won't catch your attacker. No," he said, pounding his fist on the floor. "If I want him punished, I have to do it myself. But first, I'll have to find him." He fixed his bitter gaze on Sano. "I must trouble you for another favor. Will you help me catch the bastard?" Sano realized that he and his uncle had found common ground. They both wanted justice for Chio. Sano saw the attack on Chio as a personal offense to himself as well as her immediate family. He felt a new unexpected kinship with his estranged relatives. "Of course," he said. "I'll start at once. The first thing I need to do is speak with Chiro." "Why?" "To ask her what happened." Resistance flared in Major Kumasawa's eyes. "She was kidnapped and violated. What more do we need to know? I don't want her forced to relive it. She's been through enough." Sano saw that working with his uncle would be no easy partnership. Chio will relive what happened to her whether she talks about it or not. Sano knew that although Raiko seldom spoke of the episodes of violence in her life, she still had nightmares about them. And right now, Chio was our only source of information about her attacker. "I don't want you to upset her," Major Kumasawa said, obstinate. "We should go out and shake up everyone in the district until somebody talks." We might have to resort to that eventually. But Sano couldn't ignore the best lead. The victim who had witnessed the crime, and he was getting fed up with his uncle's interference. "Understand this. I don't need your permission to question Chio." Sano rose, so did his detectives. "You can be present while I do it, but I will question her. Make no mistake." Detective Marume and Fukita looked gratified because Sano had put his foot down. Major Kumasawa stared in offense because Sano had pulled rank on him. How he must resent that Sano, the outcast, had risen so high in society. He obviously realized that he'd been giving an order he must obey, but he said, Can't you at least wait until tomorrow?" No. Sano was loath to cause further pain to Chio, but the passage of time could erase important clues from her mind. He added, "I'll be careful with her. I give you my word." Major Kumasawa rose reluctantly. "Very well." In the women's quarters, Sano and Major Kumasawa entered a room where Chio lay in bed, her mother and the physician kneeling on either side. She looked small and delicate under a thick quilt. Her eyes were closed. The right side of her head had been shaved around an ugly red cut, crossed by stitches. Major Kumasawa stared at it, appalled. The physician was a middle-aged man who wore the dark blue coat of his profession. The cut wasn't deep. He covered it with a salve and cotton pad, then wound a bandage around Chio's head. It should heal perfectly. "What about the inside of her head?" Major Kumasawa said. "It's too soon to tell." "Is she unconscious?" "No, just drowsy. I've given her a potion to ease the pain and let her sleep." The physician picked up a tray that held his instruments, jars and medicines, Chio's hair clippings and a blood-stained cloth. "I'll come back to check on her in the morning." He bowed and departed. Major Kumasawa knelt at the foot of the bed, obviously disturbed by his daughter's condition. His wife glanced up at Sano. She seemed too shy as well as too upset to speak. Chio's eyes fluttered open. She looked around her, pupils dilated, wide and blank by the drug, gaze fixed on Sano. Her lips formed broken, halting speech. Thanks. Rescuing me. Grateful. Sano was moved by her effort. Even in her condition, she had better manners than her father did. Sano knelt near her and noticed again her resemblance to his mother. She had the same sweet, pretty features set in a rectangular face. He thought of a time when he'd interrogated his mother about a crime, when she'd laid drugged and sleeped just like this. But Chio was the victim, not the accused. Chamberlain Sano is going to catch the person who did this to you, Mita Kumasawa told her. But first he needs to ask you a few questions. Only a few, his gaze warned Sano. Chio nodded weakly. Sano began in a quiet voice. Do you remember wandering in the Asakusa district before I found you? Can you tell me how you got there? A vagueness clouded her eyes. I woke up lying in an alley. My head hurt. It was raining. When I stood up, I was so dizzy I could hardly walk. I didn't know where I was, but I kept going. When I was a child, Papa told me that if I ever were lost, I should walk until I saw something I recognized. I shouldn't just cry and wait for help. Sano admired her bravery. He also approved of how Major Kumasawa had taught his daughter to be self-reliant. Did you see anyone around you when you woke up? Her forehead wrinkled. No, I don't think there was anyone. For now, Sano avoided the subject of what the kidnapper had done to Chio. Maybe he'll get enough information about the man without discussing the rape itself. He said, do you remember going to the Awashima shrine with your baby? My baby. Alarm agitated you. Where's my baby? She tried to sit up, gasping and frantic. Her mother gently restrained her, whispering, It's alright, dearest. He's safe at home. I want to go home, Chio cried. I want to see my children. They need me. I want my husband. Send for him, Major Kumasawa said. He'll take you home as soon as you're well enough to go. He asked Sano, Are you almost finished? Almost, Sano asked Chio. What happened at the shrine? She made an obvious, labored effort to calm herself. Gaze wandered as if into the past. My baby started crying. He wasn't used to so many people, so much noise. I thought that if I took him someplace quiet, he would settle. So I left my attendants and carried him into the garden. That's the last thing I remember until Chio's eyes and mouth opened wide in horror. It's something only she could see. She screamed, No! Stop! Please! And thrashed under the quilt. Help! Help! She was remembering the rape, Sano realized. Her mother tried to soothe her, but she burst into a torrent of weeping. Major Kumasawa said to Sano, That's enough. His paternal protectiveness outweighed his duty to obey Sano in a mutual wish to catch Chio's rapist. Please go.